So I'm a linguist based at the University of Birmingham. I'm originally from Australia, but I've been based here in the UK for the last 4 years. I applied for an ERC Advanced Grant to further my work on the linguistics of sign languages. This is the area that I have focused on for all of my academic career, looking at the sign languages of deaf communities, and in particular, what we can learn about the nature of human language from sign languages. Because obviously, languages primarily exist in two modalities. There are spoken languages and there are sign languages. These are the two main modalities that language exists in. And so in order to understand human language, we really need to understand both spoken and sign languages. Now, my original research in my PhD and through a lot of my career has been on Australian Sign Language, Auslan as it's called. But Auslan is related to British Sign Language, BSL, so they're historically related. So this is why I have moved to the UK and continued my research on British Sign Language, because the two are related. People don't know very much about sign languages outside of linguistics, for example. The general public doesn't know, for example, that there are many sign languages around the world, that sign languages develop spontaneously wherever deaf people come together to form a community. And because they develop spontaneously within a deaf community, their vocabulary and grammar is different from the spoken language of the surrounding community. Now, Auslan and British Sign Language, Auslan is related historically to British Sign Language because deaf people took British Sign Language out to Australia as part of the colonization of Australia. Now, British Sign Language is, we think, one of the oldest sign languages. The first schools for deaf children were opened in the late 18th century, and these schools brought together deaf children, and these schools were venues in which sign language could be transmitted from one generation to another. So we know that British Sign Language has been consistently passed down from one generation of deaf children to another since the late 18th century. So this makes it probably one of the older sign languages. We don't know. The project that I got funding for was a project that is interested in what sign languages can teach us about the nature of language. And in particular, what I'm interested in is how sign language grammars develop in the way that they are. So in particular, I'm interested in the fact that sign languages exist in different types of communities. So for example, British Sign Language, as I said, is one of the older sign languages. It's a fairly established national sign language. It's used by the entire community throughout the UK. And so this is what I call an established macro community sign language. So it's an established old sign language that's been used by a large community for a long period of time. But there are other types of sign languages in the world, other types of signing communities. So for example, there are also established micro community sign languages, sometimes called village sign languages. These are sign languages that are not used by an entire nation state, but just one small community within a nation. So examples include a kata kolok, which is a sign language used in one community in Bali in Indonesia. So it is only used in that particular community. Outside of that community, varieties of Indonesian Sign Language are used that are unrelated to that one specific sign language. Another one is Adamarobe Sign Language in Ghana. Again, a sign language that's developed within a particular community in Ghana. Now, in both of those communities, what you've got is a disproportionately large number of deaf people within that community. So often due to intermarriage within that community, the genes for deafness have become very prominent within those communities. So there's a large number of deaf people in those communities, and there have been a large number of deaf people in those communities for several generations. So the sign language that developed several generations ago has been passed down over several generations, but is only within that particular community. And within those communities, because hearing people interact a lot with deaf people, and many hearing people have deaf people in their family, many hearing people can sign as well. So it's often these communities are highly bilingual. Everyone here, everyone who's hearing can use the local sign language and also the local spoken language, at least one of them, often many more. So the established micro-community sign language and the established macro-community sign language are different from a third kind of sign language, which is the emerging sign language. These are new sign languages that have developed only recently. So for example, within Cambodia, there is Cambodian Sign Language that has begun only to develop in the last few decades as the deaf community has been unified, as deaf people have been brought together for the first time in Cambodia. Also in Nicaragua, you have a similar situation. Nicaraguan Sign Language is an emerging sign language. It began to develop in Nicaragua only in the 70s and 80s. So these are emerging sign languages. So these are young sign languages used within small communities. So we have these three major types of sign languages, and I'm interested in understanding how the different social structure of each community affects the way the language develops. I'm also interested in the fact that sign languages use a lot of iconicity. This means that the form of the sign often looks something like its meaning. So for example, in BSL, in British Sign Language, the sign for go somewhere, to go somewhere is like this, okay? So if you go somewhere, if I go to London, I sign go like that, London, go, okay? Now, one way to show that you go often to London is to produce that sign and to repeat it quickly. So if I sign something like this, I go to London often, I could sign it something like this. So you get this fast repeated movement of the sign go to, which means I go often to London. Okay, so this is an example of the grammar and how the grammar is iconic. It reflects, so not surprisingly, the meaning of go often to a place is realized by repeating the verb sign often, okay? So this is iconicity. So I also want to look at the effect of iconicity in sign languages. And the third thing is language age. So I'm comparing sign languages which are different ages, the older sign language BSL compared to an emerging sign language. I want to see how long does it take for these aspects of the grammar to develop. Okay, so I'm interested in a process called grammaticalization, which is the emergence of grammar in a language. So I'm interested in these three things, the age of sign languages, the community structure, and the iconicity. So I'm going to compare three sign languages from three different communities and do research into these issues so that we understand the grammar of sign languages better. Okay, so I think the challenge that many academics face in preparing a grant application is you often underestimate how much time it actually takes. It's a very detailed and lengthy process to prepare an application for an ERC Advanced Grant. The ERC grants are assessed in two stages, in step 1 and step 2. And for step 1, you have to prepare a 5-page summary of your project, and then for step 2, a 15-page description of the project. And you have to prepare both things before you submit the application. You don't know if you're going to get into step 2, so you don't know whether that 15 pages is going to be read, but you have to prepare both. So that's quite a big task. And I got some great advice from a colleague at the University of Birmingham who also has an ERC grant. And he suggested, okay, do the 15 pages first and then go back and do the 5-page summary later. And that's what I did. And it was very useful advice. So I would certainly suggest people do that. But also another problem I have was I spent a lot of time on that project description, and then I found that I had less time for the other parts of the application. So it's important to remember that there are many parts to the application. So consequently, almost all of August 2019 disappeared. I was very fortunate because August, of course, I didn't have any teaching commitments. So I was able to concentrate pretty much on preparing the application. And also because the ERC like projects that are high risk, they like projects that involve extending your work. So not really doing something that you have done in the past, but building on and extending and exploring new areas. And for me, this project did involve going into some new areas that I haven't worked on before. So in particular, this project involves some experimental design, some experiments that I don't have a lot of experience in. So I have proposed particular types of experiments that are to do with looking at iconicity, to do with looking at language learning, artificial language learning. And so this involved me doing a lot of reading and a lot of preparation. And even though I spent more than a month writing the application, actually the idea that I had for the proposal had been something that I'd had for a couple of years. Like the proposal idea really developed gradually. I think the first time I began to think about the idea was perhaps way back in 2013. I started to think about planning a project to look at grammar in these different types of sign language communities way back in 2013. And the idea gradually developed over time. I was going to submit an application in 2018, but I misunderstood some aspects of the ERC guidelines, which meant I thought that I wasn't eligible to apply. So this was a mistake of my own. It was, in retrospect, of course, it was a silly mistake to make because I applied in 2019 and I was successful in getting the grant. But one of the criteria for the advanced grant is that you have to have 10 journal articles in the last 10 years in which you are the main author. Now, I misunderstood main author as meaning first author. And a lot of the projects that I've been involved in the last 10 years have involved working with postdocs or PhD students. And I've always taken the approach that we have the postdoc or the PhD student as the first author. Okay, so I'm the senior author. I might hold the grant that funds the research that postdoc or PhD student has done, but I always make sure, in order to promote their career, that they are first. So I looked at my publication list in the last 10 years, and I realized that I wasn't first author on a lot of those publications. So I misunderstood the term main author to mean first author, and so I didn't think I was eligible. But then when I discussed it further with the research office at my university, it became clear to me that main author can mean first author, or it can mean the senior author, the grant holder on a particular project. So that meant that once I realized my mistake, I began the process of applying in 2019. So I think this was a silly mistake on my part that I think I could have solved this by simply speaking, explaining my problem to the research office at the university. And I also could have contacted the ERC for clarification, but I kind of just assumed, and I didn't put in my application that year, but then I ended up putting it in the next year. So I think there's some of the issues that applicants have to understand the application process, all the details of the application process. They have to make sure that they allow themselves enough time to complete the application. And it also should be, I think, for a project, I know the ERC likes high-risk projects, so I think that it probably has to be a project that extends your work into new domains, okay? So this is one of the exciting things about the project that I have, is that it does involve working with some new research methodologies that I haven't really used before. So I do think the European Research Council, the ERC, really likes those kinds of high-risk projects in which you're extending your work into new areas. The research project that I'm looking at is very theoretical. It's very interested in a linguistic question, which is looking at sign languages in order to understand human languages generally. It also has lots of applications. Obviously, understanding the grammar of sign languages has lots of applied dimensions. So improving our understanding about the grammar of these sign languages will have lots of benefits for example, sign language teaching, in training sign language interpreters, for education for deaf children. It will have lots of those applied impacts. But the actual research question is a real blue sky kind of question. It's a very theoretical question. It's about exploring, okay, what can we learn about human language from looking at sign languages? So I like the fact that the project is both theoretical and applied. And I think that the European Research Council is very interested in supporting these kinds of very blue sky exploratory research projects. So I think that's a great thing about the ERC, the fact that it supports this kind of research. Project that I've got funding for is a fairly large and long project, and one of the best things about it is I'm looking forward to, there are 3 postdocs and 1 PhD on my project. And I'm really looking forward to the fact that a project of this size means that I can create my own research lab, my own team at the University of Birmingham. And I'm very, very keen to ensure that the postdocs and the PhD students that I encourage, that I'm able to recruit deaf colleagues to this team. Because at the moment I work in a Department of English Language and Linguistics, and I work on sign languages, but all of my colleagues in my department are hearing people. And so I really look forward to the opportunity that this funding will give me to create a small team that I hope will include deaf colleagues, so that we can have a deaf hearing team working on this project. So I think those are two of definitely the advantages for the ERC grants for me. The fact that they are interested in supporting innovative new blue sky research ideas, but also the fact that they provide sufficient funding so that you can build a team to work on this project over an extended period. So it means that you can ask the really big picture questions and come up with a research project that can hopefully address some of those big picture questions, both because you have the funding to support a large team over a long period, but also because those kinds of big picture questions are the things that the ERC is really interested in seeing applications about. Within Australia, I know that there's a lot of focus on the Australian Research Council grants, and I've been very lucky that I have been the recipient of Australian Research Council grants in the past myself when I was based in Australia. I also currently hold an ARC grant with an Australian colleague. But I think that this means that many of the university research officers are very geared towards providing information about ARC grants, and often information about the ERC. Just from my own experience talking about having gotten this grant with Australian colleagues, I've realized that many Australian colleagues aren't aware, for example, that that anyone from anywhere in the world can apply for an ERC grant. all you have to do is commit to 50% of your time being based in an EU or associated country institution. So obviously this is a challenge for people who are at an advanced stage of their career in Australia, might be settled in Australia, they might have family or caring duties, so this means that they can't necessarily travel to live in an EU country. But there are grants such as the Synergy grants, which are big projects that involve teams in different parts of the world to collaborate with European researchers. So people who are more settled and less likely to want to travel outside of Australia can always look at applying for a Synergy grant with European researchers. But also people who are in an earlier stage in their career and perhaps have fewer commitments and are more mobile, so can think about things like the starter grants. So the starter grants that the European Research Council offer are excellent opportunities for early career researchers in Australia. So people who are just finishing up their PhD or finishing up a postdoc and are interested in working in a European institution. The wonderful thing about the starter grants is, again, they provide a significant amount of funding, so you can plan quite a major project. So I would really encourage Australian academics to make their PhD students and postdocs aware of these opportunities with the starter grants, for example. And also for people who are more settled in Australia to consider the Synergy grants in collaboration with European researchers. So there's quite, I think the fact that EURAXESS has now opened an office in Australia means that more of this information will become available to Australian and New Zealand researchers, and people will become more aware of the fact that the ERC takes applications from all over the world. I think make yourself familiar with the information on the ERC website. There's a lot of information there about how to apply for these grants. There are also some I would say, follow the ERC on Twitter and other social media, so you keep in touch with announcements. There are also some very useful video guides on the ERC website that explain the process of applying for grants. There's also information, video interviews with successful applicants. So there is a wealth of information online about how to apply for ERC grants and other types of EU funding. So I would suggest to my colleagues in Australia and New Zealand is check these websites out and read all the available information. Also, I would, my experience discussing this with Australian colleagues suggests that the research officers in Australian universities aren't always fully informed about the opportunities. So it seems my experience is that some colleagues have had European funding suggested to them by their research officers at the universities. Some colleagues feel that the research officers at the universities may not be as aware of these opportunities. So I would suggest, work with your research office to get the information and ensure that your research office at your university is up to speed with the information. But there's a lot of information online, so you can certainly find out this information yourself. So, and also my experience with contacting the European Research Council or obviously working with EURAXESS, I found them to be very helpful and provide lots of information. So this would be my advice, is